if nobody minds. Yeah, can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, just give me a sec. Sorry. The colonials came and looted, took resources and wealth. They took, but I would like to say they also gave. They thought they were bringing love without realizing they were sowing the seeds of revolt and hatred. Ladies and gentlemen, that was supposed to be an apology for colonialism made in 2007 by Nicolas Sarkozy, then President of France. On Team Canada today, we believe talk is cheap. We think it's time for colonialism to end once and for all, and we're going to be the team to do that. Before we get into our argumentation, I'd like to start with the model. First of all, we think that the former colonies this is going to apply to are going to apply to colonies that have been completely and directly controlled by EU countries in the past. Let's make it really clear which countries we're talking about. For the sake of your interest, there's a group called the Afro-Pacific Caribbean Group, composed of 79 countries that were directly ruled by European powers, meaning their governments were ruled by European powers, their policy was set by European powers. We're not talking about countries like China, who had their own state, but let's say had oppressive trade policies on them. We want to make it very clear what we're talking about. There is a purpose to this debate, ladies and gentlemen, which is about reparation and making amends for all the terrible things EU countries have done in the past, which means that Team Denmark has to deal with that core principle, not just talk about specific things they decide that they don't want to be unrestricted, or specific countries they think should be exempted. These are all the things we are exempting them from. Number one, trade restrictions or business restrictions. They should have complete free trade. They should be able to do as much business in Europe as they want. No price control policies like subsidies or dumping. No intellectual property laws. No debt. All of it will be forgiven. No monetary control, such as the forced allocation of foreign currency into treasuries. We would return resource ownership. No thank you to those countries. No World Trade Organization mandates would apply to them, and they would have full mobility in terms of no requirements of visas and a lower burden of citizenship. We want to make very clear, this is not reciprocal. Any of these countries can impose those same restrictions back on the other countries. We don't think that's up for discussion. Now, I'd like to talk about the principle. Okay. Why is there a categorical reason why no restrictions can be placed on these countries? First of all, we think colonialism in and of itself is an oppressive and genocidal restriction where they did not have consent from the people that they put it on. So for them to say that any restrictions they made after that are somehow legitimate after the oppression they did, we think is laughable. But second, colonialism constituted murder and genocide. You cannot expect victims of that to then give you certain things that you say that they owe you by virtue of agreements. But I want to spend on this. Why even today, because this is not just a matter of the past, but why even today this is so important? Because colonialism isn't over, and we're going to show you exactly why that's true. First of all, because of monetary control. Because 14 African colonies are required to put 85% of their foreign currency in the French treasury. They only have access to 15% of their foreign money. Because of things like Togo, after Guinea was bombed by the French for resisting colonial rule, they were bullied into paying 40% of their tax revenue to the French government. It happens in terms of resource control, where they own the resources in other countries. Right? In the example of France, not only does the French government own resources, but any newly discovered resources have direct preference to France as opposed to any other country. It comes in terms of contract control, where in the city of Abidjan, the Ivory Coast wanted to build a bridge, and the Chinese offered to do it at half the price, but the governments of the European Union, including Britain and France, said no, it is illegal, you're not allowed to do that. Finally, things like price control, where subsidies that make the price of food so cheap, or dumping, where you go to another country and sell goods at a loss but below domestic market value to drive their businesses out of market aggressively. Those ruin the economies of developing nations. So, again, they can't be sticklers about what kind of policies they want to talk about. This is categorical oppression that can't be tolerated. Go ahead.
If you think the economy is so bad, and the companies there doesn't really have that well at competing with other companies, how are they going to compete against established companies in the EU?
The reason that they can't compete is because they haven't been given a fair playing field. You think when you give them that, they will be able to compete. I'll explain that in a second. Now onto the issue of mobility. Let's be very clear. We are on a continent that was built by those who lived under colonialism. We think it's dogmatic that they then are prevented from being able to live in these countries, are prevented from being able to enter these countries, right? In the case of 6 Commonwealth African countries where individuals have to pay a £3,000 down payment in order to get a 6-month visa, we think that is laughable. They built this place, they should be able to access it. But finally, we think any imposition they say was like a fair deal between those countries was coerced. In large part because of things like indirect rule, because in countries like Chad or in countries like Angola, the Safari Club went in and deposed governments in order to fight Soviet rule or to get their interests represented. When the Bank of Credit and Commerce International loans money to oppressive dictators in order to make sure that they maintain control, we say that's coercion, that's not consent. The importance of this argument is that it is not contingent on any outcome. It is not contingent on whether these countries will be better off afterwards. We say any restriction levied is a principal violation of the greatest degree and we're not willing to support it. On to the argument about practical benefits. Okay. Why is this good in and of itself? Because even if they somehow prove that these practical benefits aren't tied to any restrictions placed, we say the sheer volume of oppression that the EU has levied against these countries makes it so that any practical benefit that can come out of this policy serves as reparation. Let's make it clear. We don't think there will ever be sufficient reparation for colonialism, but we think this is a place to start. How are these countries improved domestically? And by the way, my partner is third argument going to talk about how the foreign policy interaction between these nations and others is improved. First of all, they get to have the growth of their own business class when they're not affected by predatory monetary policies. When the European Central Bank can't hold them to the CFA agreement that determines their own monetary policy, the businesses of these countries can grow. When they get control over their own resources, they can start extracting them and they can start selling them and they can make money off of them. No thank you. When they are ridden of the huge, encumbersome debt that has been levied on them by the developed world and the EU because of the fact that they're in such a dire state because of colonialism. And then countries like Zimbabwe have to print so much money that their currency becomes devalued to quite literally the point where the central bank had to cut 10 zeros off of the denomination of their currency. You see that's ridiculous. They shouldn't be forced into this. Finally, we think they actually get control over their own money because it's not in the treasuries of other countries, because it's not being forced to spend on agreements they were coerced into. Notice that $1.4 trillion of African money was lost illicitly to the West between 1980 and 2009. That is 233 times more than all of the foreign aid that has ever been given to Africa in the history of the world. So we think that this idea that the EU is making up for in the status quo is quite frankly laughable. We think removing these restrictions, giving Africa and the Caribbean and Latin America and South America the kind of independence that they haven't had is so important to making sure that their people can actually live. Because we say, especially when it comes to things like intellectual property, things as basic as AIDS drugs are denied to these people because of such predatory pressing from the countries that can say, we invent life-saving medication and therefore we have the right to deny people it, even though the state of disease in a lot of these colonies is the direct fault of the countries that colonize them. We say overall, this is a principal debate, but we also have to consider the welfare of the people who have been subjugated for far too long. On Team Canada, we want to protect these people. Enough is enough. Thank you very much.
Now the principal stance that came out of the EU proposition can be summed up by one sentence. Colonialism was bad. We agree. We in fact believe it was so bad that we had a moral obligation to make amends in terms of actual practical benefits. But Mr. Speaker, that principle is contingent upon practical outcomes. Because we didn't give analysis as to why free trade specifically actually improves the conditions for these developing countries and makes amends for the atrocities of the past, we are so proud to be in opposition today. Okay, we have three articles today. First of all, we're going to look at the EU, secondly, former colonies, and thirdly, Clara's going to talk to you about integration. But let's first clear up some things about stances and burdens of this debate. Fundamentally, we don't believe that we are here to prove the status quo and ideal. We have to prove that this, that free trade is simply not better for the EU, not better for the former colonies, and that the status quo actually caters to the delicate conditions that are inherent to the trade relationship between these different actors. Now, well, before I go into my constructive matter, I'd like to add a bit of refutation. Basically, this first argument about the principle analysis I've already taken down. Well, this second idea about exploitation of former French colonies in terms of currency is set. First of all, we say that this is done on a voluntary basis. That's because it's actually quite beneficial in terms of having these things in French reserves. That's because it stabilizes the CFA franc in the 14, former French nations. It's inherently beneficial to have a stable currency to create a sustainable economy. That point falls to our side. Now, this second idea about practical benefits, which is basically just like an assertion that now these countries can extract resources themselves. We in fact say that free trade goes to the opposite way of this, because now we have foreign companies from the EU going in and extracting the resources, no thank you, not giving profit to these economies, not actually giving any sort of revenue to the people who actually need it. We actually do no analysis as to why specifically free trade is the way to do this. We argue, we said in the PY, that these countries are inherently vulnerable to these big companies. I'm going to be elaborating on this in my constructive manner. Well, the EU didn't give a justification as to why we need to specifically do this for free trade, not simply just foreign aid or different kind of diplomatic relations. They need to address this in their second speech. Now, moving into my first point about the obligation of the EU, no thank you. We see that EU countries, first and foremost, have an obligation towards their own citizens. We see that when you remove restrictions in terms of trade, you're forcing these EU countries to make a trade-off, right? Between the cheap labour force of these former colonies or their own workers. This is because these high and uncompetitive European wages are inherently not competitive in terms of the cheap labour that can be found in these former colonies. We see that the reason why the EU has this specific obligation is because the EU citizens are the ones who funds the EU budget, the ones who pay taxes to the budget. This means that they are the ones who should be catered to by specifically the EU. No thank you. We'll give an example no thank you. The common agricultural policy. We see that the CAP is a system of agricultural subsidies that's aimed to sustain the European supply of agricultural products, such as sugar, rice, and vegetables. We see this as fundamental benefits for the EU in terms of maintaining domestic industry. We in fact see 4 to 6 million people on board because of this. But because in terms of no fun here, with instability in foreign countries, you should have a stable home economy. You're less vulnerable to all fluctuations in the map. Now, let's look at what happens when we remove these EU regulations, because on their side of the house, we remove the restriction, but we don't impose all the regulations that the countries in the EU face in the status quo. No thank you. This means that now we're allowing these companies to outsource to these former colonies with all the safeguards and mechanisms regulations that the EU imposes in the status quo. This has fundamental harms, right? First of all, in terms of job laws. We see that it undermines the healthy labour laws of the EU. No thank you, since there's now a cheap alternative. That means that they can now move to former colonies and capitalise upon looser labour laws. Mr. Speaker, this is fundamentally just a new form of colonialism, which now they're going in and directly profit upon these worst working conditions of these former colonies, principally very unjustified. No thank you. But let's move on to talk to you about the environment. Because we see that you get all these kinds of environmental regulations inside the EU market in the status quo. You don't get on their side of the house because these companies, these former colonies will not accept to all these regulations because they can't, quite frankly, compete on an equal term with the European companies. We see it's incredibly harmful, no thank you, that we don't get all these kind of environmental regulations, which these developing countries that the former colonies are detrimental in the fight against climate change. We only get that on our side of the house. We should also further industrialization in these countries on their side of the house, thus increasing carbon emission, very important safeguards that we have in the EU. Now, moving into my second constructive point about the former colonies. First of all, why tariffs are good for former colonies. Well, before we continue, you'd seem to disagree.
So in our model, we said it was non-reciprocal. You have freedom operating within Europe, but any goods that come out can be tariffed and taxed as much as these countries want.
We see that fundamentally not how free trade works. We see you need to have this kind of reciprocity in a relationship for this deal actually to work, right? We don't see that EU countries will never really actually benefit in terms of this. Also, we see that in the free trade agreements in the status quo, the TTIP and the TPP, there's all these kind of extra layers, right? All these kind of ways to work around the general agreement. So we're pretty sure there would be a way of exploiting these countries, because countries generally do not make economic decisions that don't cater to their own self-interest. Now, moving on to why tariffs are good for former colonies. You should see that there's still a weak industry. If you have a weak industry, we see that free trade eliminate the internal demand for that industry. That's because you get these big, strong companies, right, into the competition that generally undermines the developing structures of the economy. We're giving empirical evidence suggesting that free trade doesn't even really improve economic growth in general. We see this after the implementation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Mexico only improved with less than 1%. Annually, while the entirety of the Latin American economy improved annually by 1.9%. We see this as evidence to this point. Now, we also argue that the EU doesn't have an inherent interest in not supporting the diversification of these companies. This point also changes to your definition of terms of non-repository, right? Because we see that now the EU countries would want specific natural resources from these countries. They don't want services, they want things like minerals, things like cocoa beans from Congo, all these kind of things. We argue that they don't have an inherent interest in trying to help them diversify their economies because they want only this kind of thing. This is very harmful because it's a gross misinterpretation of the principle of comparative advantage. Now, you're only going to try to limit the economy and what it's able to do because of self-interest. Very harmful in the long run for these developing countries. Now, let me end my speech by talking about inter-African trade. Because we see that right now, inter-African trade stands at around only 13%, compared to 40% in Europe, in the EU, and 60% in the North American region. We see that once you begin to intertwine former colonies and the EU, you lessen the incentive for further regional integration in the African, on the African country and amongst the former colonies, the ACAP as I mentioned as well. This is fundamentally harmful because we see there's multiple benefits in terms of regional trade agreements, right? First of all, you should have the same standards. You don't have this huge disparity between incomes amongst the different colonies, meaning that you don't get this exploitation of cheap labor that you get when you intertwine the EU market with these former colonies. But secondly, we say that there's generally a lack of incentive to try to utilize the food surplus that you have in Africa right now. So we see that if countries actually work together, the World Bank points to the fact that Africa could feed itself. Because we're the ones who actually make amends for the historic atrocities. We're so proud, so close. Thank
cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, aiming at subjugating its growth and development for foreign use. Colonizers are the ones who indebted Africa. We had no connection with this debt. Therefore, we had no obligation to repay this debt. That was a quote by Thomas Sankara. He was the president of Burkina Faso. That was the principle that we defended on our side of the house. The response that we got from their side was very fickle. They said, well, the principle doesn't matter because it's practicality and the net benefit of the world that matters at the end. Here's the problem. Practically, even if we were to take them at the very highest ground, we say that if you screw over countries and you completely damage their economy, the very least you could do is not continue your legacy of continuously damaging that economy. You cannot justify plunder by saying it's beneficial on the whole. Furthermore, what I'm going to prove to you in my speech is why self-assertion as a nation is so crucial for the benefits of that economy as a whole. And it's on that nation, it's on that basis that I'm so proud of the proposal. I'm going to do a few things for you in my speech. I'm going to start with 2 points of order. No, thank you. First of all, on the effect on the economy. Secondly, on the principle. I'm going to then conclude with my final argument about foreign policy. Let's do our first point of rebuttal about the effect on the economy. The first thing that they said as well, if the economy is so bad, then how can these colonies compete with the European Union? First thing to say is the only reason they can't compete with the European Union in the status quo is because they're not even on an equal playing field to start with. We give you the example of, like, for example, the EU gained a lot of money because of colonialism, because that's how they gained so much technology and innovation. Because of intellectual property restrictions that Armin talked about in his speech, the EU can then patent all those technologies, which means that the African nations and colonies can then never actually get access to those technologies because they're so expensive. What you get at our side of the house is that now they can actually build those for themselves because they're not so expensive that patents they become prohibited for those kind of things. That means that these nations can finally get the AIDS drugs, and you actually solve that that problem of competition, which really isn't competition at all on their side of the house. The next thing that we have to talk about, they mentioned, was that foreign companies can just go into colonies, and the same things would happen like on our side. What Armin told you in POI was very clear. This is not a reciprocal policy, right? In the status quo, companies can go into these colonies, but the colonies can't do anything in return. This isn't competition at all. What they said was, well guys, we said that we support free trade, and this isn't technically free trade. Okay, that's attacking the title of the argument. It isn't attacking the analysis behind it. If we introduce the right word, okay, sorry, you can sue me, but like, that's not the analysis. It's the purpose of the piece that matters the most, and that's what I told you. The next thing that they told us under the title of the economy is that the European Union nations can then diversify, and that's really good. We think that under our side of the house, we actually think that when these countries have purchasing power, they're a lot more likely to diversify. For example, China is more likely under our side of the house to invest in colonies when they have mobile infrastructure. That demand is what creates that incentive to diversify. And so we actually think that we can that demand a lot more when there's an equal playing field. But secondly, we actually say that diversification, we actually say that on their side of the house, they take more money out of these countries than they give into these countries. They give the example of African aid, where the European Union literally took out 233 times more money than they gave into foreign aid. So you literally can't say taking in money, taking out money, like the net deficit of money from a poor, starving country is good for that country's economy. They literally have to justify a deficit in the economy. That's plain mathematics, and they can't justify that in their house. The last thing I want to talk about in rebuttal is this question of the principle. And they were incredibly clear. They literally said, their intro was, the principle doesn't matter. It's the net benefit that matters the most. The only thing that they said under the principle was just like, protectionism is good. Right. So they said the EU has an obligation to protect its own citizens. We say that we don't that. It's your fault that you screwed over these countries. If you created a problem, you have an obligation to fix it. No, you can't brush over that obligation. And we think that even as I told you in my intro, you can't justify plunder by saying it's beneficial to everyone as a whole, especially if you're just taking money out of people's economies. Okay. Let's move on to my constructive argument. My constructive argument is going to be about foreign policy. Sure.
If it's really so beneficial to have trade with the EU, why will African countries ever have an incentive to improve regional trade ties within the continent?
We think that incentive actually exists a lot more on our side of the house because these patents don't exist. They actually have the ability to make these companies and make these products in a world in which these things are prohibitively affecting the status quo. I've already talked about intellectual property. I've already done it. Okay. Foreign policy, I have two subjects. First I want to talk about bilateral relations, and then I want to talk about multilateral relations. Bilateral relations. First, let's talk about the status quo. We have to recognize that there's often a deep-rooted resentment against these countries, against colonial power. Let's give you the example of India. There's literally an entire passage of the Indian national anthem that says, Hindus and Muslims all came together to rise up against their oppressor. And considering the fact that this national anthem was written during British colonial rule, I'm pretty sure we all know who this oppressor really was. What their side really does is the resentment is furthered by the fact that, the British say colonialism really is over, but at the same time, the Indian government has to pay a small portion of their taxes to Queen Elizabeth, right? That resentment is further. What are the impacts on foreign policy? Two impacts. The first impact is that developing nations are very hesitant to interact with their former colonizers. They're very hesitant to engage with things like environmental treaties and economic policies. Because they feel as if this is a person who has consistently done us wrong. But not only that, they say that they've stopped doing us wrong, but really they're just continuing to oppress us. So they're very hesitant to engage with them. But more importantly, even if they do engage with them, which sometimes happens, the colonies and the colonizing powers almost always get the better end of the deal. For example, in the 2009 treaty between the European Union and India, Delhi ended up in such a severely bad economic situation where they couldn't use emergency economic policies. The result is that they lost $6 billion in lost revenue. What happened with this resolution? Two main things. The first is that it sets a precedent that we're actually committed to stopping oppressing, right? We're not just going to have words, but we're actually going to continue with our actions. The impact of that is that these countries are more likely to take these colonizing powers seriously. They're more likely to engage with them, and that hostility going to at least stop at where it is now, if not is going to increase. But more importantly, and this is now a second subpoint about multilateral agreements. What happens in the status quo is that in the WTO, for example, African countries get little to no representation. There's literally only one African country for the WTO which has any policy relating to Africa. What happens now is that these countries are always seen as equals. One country is not seen as subservient to the other country, and every country is seen as one's own country. You can actually self-assert your needs as your nation. Your policies and your actions are not defined as what other countries think that you will be able to do. What happens as an impact is that it's much harder for other countries to flush African concern or colonize countries' concern under the rug, because their concerns are just as much important as other concerns. At the end of this debate, this is a debate about true liberation and autonomy, and oppression under the guise of liberation and autonomy. Because we believe that all countries deserve dignity and the right to self-assertion, and every country should be treated as equal. We are so incredibly proud.
we fundamentally is going to prove to you in this debate goes ahead and further harms it. Insofar we then actually manage to prove to you that by removing these restrictions to provide more damage to the entire economy, which they totally outlined to you we destroy colonialism, we will take today's debate. We're not against principal reparations. We think this is a completely different debate. We can get foreign aid, we can pay back in another way, but please do not do this in such a way that you completely mess up the country for the rest of eternity. Okay, we have a few pieces of problems. The first thing they then tried to outline to us was this idea that, oh, you know what, these nations gave so much money to places like the French treasure. Ladies and gentlemen, the really great thing about prepared motions is that we are actually ready for these sort of things. When they come and tell you that it's like 500 billion we give, 85% of our economy we give to these French treasures, we're telling you that this is actually wrong. Why is this wrong? We already found an article by Cecil Bobby quoted in The Guardian, which states, no everyone, we are only literally allowing around 20 billion within these French reserves. The reason why we allow France to have this direct control over our reserves is because this is directly helping the economy. Why? A couple of reasons. First of all, when you make sure that it's not like these sort of kind of messed up governments, no thank you, that have control over all their money, investors are going to be more likely to want to invest in these sort of countries. That is very, very, very important. The second response as to why we're actually doing this is because we're directly linking the currency of these people, of these places, to the franc. You need to continue to have a fixed exchange rate, making sure that these economies don't totally die out. They try to give us the example of Zimbabwe, but the main issue with Zimbabwe, and the reason why their economy is failing, is because they have backed down on these restrictions. That is the inherent issue. So insofar you want to actually support these economies, you have to support this idea that we give money to the French. Having already taken down the most ridiculous point from their idea, let's talk about the second reason we're talking. It's actually, how is free trade detrimental, even with their screaming saying, we will only allow these sort of people to do it. Okay, first of all, diversifying the economy. What we're telling you is that the EU is not interested in diversification. The EU, no thank you, is interested in specific raw materials, such as, for instance, the Congo with raw cocoa. Essentially, what we told you is what is really harmful and why none of your analysis now is that they try to tell you that just by gaining access to the European market, we fix the issue. Have you considered the Rome Treaty? Because that can allow these sort of countries to have easier access to the EU. What caused this to happen? Luckily, this was this all when we had another treaty in 2007. I think it was that, because it proved so detrimental. But essentially, what happened with this sort of treaty when we gave them access was that Congo, which produces cocoa beans, came in here with the raw materials. However, we would only in the EU buy the raw materials so we could process them ourselves, because as we all know, we earn quite much more. So what happened was that Congo, with a non-diversified economy, only ended up earning $2 million from all these companies, whereas Germany, no thank you, ended up benefiting just by importing these things and then selling them with $3.3 million. Why is that really important in today's debate? Because what these countries, when we begin to remove these restrictions, are going to do is only produce what the EU wants. No thank you, because the EU can pay more than the general population, so it's going to be easier for all these companies to just go towards these. Essentially what we then tell you, there's going to be two horrible things to this. First of all, this means you're relying on a world market, meaning that any sort of fluctuation that might happen here is going to be detrimental to your entire situation. And the second and really harmful thing is this idea of let's talk about biofuels, right? So already what we see happening is that these sort of people, because biofuels are something the EU is really interested in, are really to totally cut down on all only produce sugar canes, which is really not benefiting the entire population of this country. Why is that important? Because when we remove restrictions, people are going to do this to a large extent. Literally producing these sort of biofuels are sold in 20 to 30% of the global food crisis, meaning that people in these sort of developing countries, in the form of countries, are literally not able to pay their food because every single production goes towards what the EU wants because the EU can't pay. Therefore, you must make sure that the EU has less interest in buying these sort of things, so we have the inherent interest, so we have the people in the population with having their important produced food. And just for the sake of it, biofuels are really not that great for the environment, so don't make that case because I'm going to feed them very as a Okay, let's get into the very peaceful. Okay, last bit. Even if the EU is going to do this, what we're going to see happening is that the EU, by WTO laws, are basically allowed to choose the kind of products they want in. Why is that really important in today's debate? Insofar as they do not live up to phytosanitary and sanitary restrictions that the EU imposes, these can simply decide to just shut down. So you're going to have two scenarios exactly going to happen. First of all, the EU is going to have to lower their entire prices and standards. That can't really happen. Or second of all, they're just going to deny these access. Essentially, this is just a back way to protectionism. That is really important in today's debate. Okay, so we talk about foreign policy. Essentially, like, this works foreign policy actually kind of like falls to their entire case. Like, it's more harmful to them. Why is that? Because when I have restrictions with my country, I'm going to be more likely to cater to them. That is why France like continue to look and favor these countries in the UN. But when I see happening, this country is doing really, really well, and I no longer have all the benefits of like them only going ahead, you know, having to build towards me, then that's the entire like investment, and I will no longer have that incentive to cater to these countries doing really well. That's harmful because having this sort of political capital in the UN is far better than anything they could possibly propose. We tell you when France directly goes in and gives 10 billion every single year to these former colonies, that is important. That's why they have the ability and why it's okay for them to demand that colonies that, you know, only build with French products. Essentially what we tell you is that we have a competitive better analysis of the house. Also, just because like this is literally the reason why France going to like stop the civil war happening in Mali, because like they have to sort of restrict and impose regulations. We think that's really important because like civil wars are pretty bad for the economy. But you seem to be disagreeing.
So on your point that they're going to be dependent on EU markets, these 79 countries make up billions of people, but they can't export to each other when the export priority, such in the face of contracting, is dictated by the EU countries that still hold control of it.
Also, I think like kind of want to disprove this sort of fact. You think like African countries are likely to already in the South will be able to transport with one another. This is really important. Second of all, we think that the EU restrictions actually make sure that they want to see these sort of economies prosper, because when they prosper, they can buy more French goods, but they have inherent interest to do so. Let me get into my last and final argument, which is why we're going to take this debate today. Because it was like really bloody stupid to understand immigration. Already what we see happening in the status quo is that we have a huge surge of right-wing populists. So what we're now allowing for is like surges of people who literally live in poverty so great, they're so desperate they'll just flock into the EU. We're talking about countries such as Niger, countries that are in Lebanon, Palestine, Libya, Sri Lanka, and Syria. So suddenly we have all of these immigrants who are allowed within the EU. What's going to happen to the EU? They're not going to really love this. So we think that the vast majority of countries are going to then say, actually, we no longer want to be a part of this solution. We think what we did this time ago is not something we have a responsibility to anymore. So you're not going to have any benefits because these people are simply going to opt out of the EU. We think that this already happened with Britain when they said she was. So none of the benefits we're actually proposing is even so going to have anything. We must acknowledge the interest of the EU. So let's just like look at the criteria which you set out in today's debate and why we totally take all of those. Just like free trade, I proved to you how this will harm the diversification, meaning we're actually making sure that people within the population cannot get food because we are only applying to the EU markets because these are the people who can pay more. They never responded to any of Emil's analysis on how you're also needing to outsource them, meaning your EU is going to have to go on lower products, lower standards, lower prices. That is detrimental to the EU. And like also because the people earning money of this in this country are probably just going to be like the companies, right? Like that's not really beneficial to the country. So essentially, the last like thing they gave immigration, not going to be a benefit, anyone opts out, and intellectual property is not exactly important to this debate, because like, let's just say that the company then goes out and develops this in the US, like there's not going to be any like inherent thing to the EU. Okay,
was built by selling the blood, sweat, tears, lives, and future of Africa and the other colonized nations. That is why, at the very least, Europe has a responsibility to the people to make their lives better. And I think because side opposition decided to kind of ignore all of the bad things we told you, to point to them finding 2 restrictions that came out of colonialism that were good, but because they kind of ignored the rest of them, we think we're still winning this debate. So on that, what am I going to be doing today to close out this debate on the substantive proposition? I'm going to give you a couple miscellaneous things, then 2 themes. First of all, I'm going to talk about everyone else besides colonized nations, and then I'm going to talk about colonized nations. But first, a couple miscellaneous things. They said their burden was kind of to prove that free trade was bad. We think they have to show you just a little bit more than that. We think what they have to show you is that giving back autonomy, giving back control of their monetary policy to colonized nations, because that is what has been taken away by EU restrictions, is what they have to prove is going to be bad or not good for some kind of reason. That's what they have to prove. They can't just take the 2 nice things about like environmental regulation and say, okay, great, over, don't worry, get rid of it. Okay, the second thing they have to do is really deal with this principle, because they say that people have the principle to protect the EU. I think they should deal with a larger principle, because what makes them have to care about the EU? It's probably because people pay taxes to those countries, because they contribute to the society and building the nation. We know Africa and all the other colonized nations did the exact same thing. In fact, many African countries do pay taxes to the 2 EU nations. So that's their criteria for who they have to protect. It probably falls on our side as well. Great, that's dealt with. Let's get into the debate. Let's talk about Taiwan, but before that,
if France control like these restrictions that benefit France the status quo, why do they on their small side house have an incentive to create a stable economy in the former colonies?
okay, here's what we think. We think that the former colonies are not completely incompetent. The reason they can't do anything is because they don't have control of their monetary policy. Because their monetary policy is set by the European bank. That's true because they're working on this like CFA, which is tied to the euro. So that's why they don't have control of their monetary policy. All these different things which are turning the economies to crap aren't the fault of the people. It's the fault that it's actually controlled by European colonies who don't really have financial incentive in their own interest. They're comparing their own financial incentive. Okay, apart from that, let's deal with what they've really said in the debate today. So what we heard from them is first of all talking about the EU. First of all, what did they say? They said because trade between the EU and like cheap labor and other places is going to happen, the EU has responsibility to care about its own people, stuff like that. First of all, a lot of this stuff doesn't actually happen because there's not a reciprocal thing that we outlined in our law. There's no reciprocal like ties on their side of the house. We outlined why none of that's happening. But furthermore, what we tell you is that most trade deals, and if they want to talk about trade deals, most trade deals that are happening right now between the EU and the former colonies are actually very predatory in the favor of these EU nations. So to that, we think that they're not really doing any good. In fact, all these things that they're building are in fact predatory, which are hurting the colonies, not helping them. And finally, what we tell you is the second thing they told you under this is the idea of the environment. First of all, we don't think that people are completely unwilling to pass environmental regulation in these colonized places, especially when they're the ones disproportionately being hurt by the mining, by the resource extraction that's happening in their country. We think they probably have some modicum of care for their own people, and because of that, they're probably going to pass some kind of regulation. We don't think that, and even if that was the case, we think they have to do a little bit more than say we're benefiting the environment on their side of the house. Okay, what else did they tell you? Next thing they tell you is the idea about a massive influx of white people trying to get into like the EU. First of all, we just don't think that's plausible because we don't think many people in these colonized colonies are just going to get up and say, screw it, I'm moving somewhere else. Excuse me, Pat. No, thank you. But furthermore, even if they do, what we tell you is that when you remove the restrictions, there's less of an incentive because that are actually making the country better because you're giving them back autonomy, you're giving them back control of their monetary policy, and you're giving them an ability to make their country better. Because of that, there's lots of incentive to leave. And finally, in the worst case scenario, if everyone really wants to go to the EU, they kind of built the place. They're still paying taxes to the place. So at the very least, it's principally okay on our side of the house, because if either way you're going to live in crappy conditions, it might as well be with the people who made it crappy conditions in the first place. Okay, what did we tell you under this idea of principle? We talked about colonialism, and we talked about neo-colonialism, and how we still have control of their monetary policy, how like right now, like Togo is paying 40% GDP to other places. Okay, what did they tell you? First of all, they said, well, this is kind of voluntary because there's benefits. That's just not true. Okay, and even if it was voluntary, they said, yeah, we'll sign the deal. This is taking place after 1958. Guinea got completely destroyed by France because they refused to sign on with what France wanted them to do. So after that, when France said, hey, you guys consider independence, people were a little little bit more inclined to say, no, we're going to kind of listen to what you were saying, because they didn't want to get destroyed to the same way that Guinea felt that effect. Furthermore, they kind of just called us out on this thing trying to say, like, an article they found says that, like, people are paying, like, 85% of their GDP, 85% of their GDP. Let me break it down to you. Here's what it is. 65% goes as an agreement, and another 10% is taken for liability reasons. So it is 85%. They're just claiming, they're just ignoring the part that is taken by the French National Treasury because of liability reasons. They just ignore that when they gave that stat. We tell you that actually we're telling you factually true information. Apart from that, the last thing they said is that because they're investing, because people are investing in money, they think it's okay, it's all good, because they're doing good. Let me explain, yeah, it's true they're investing. The French National Treasury is investing, but they're investing it as their own money in their own stock accounts. So we tell you that's probably not going to be the greatest thing, because they're literally taking money to invest in their own places, in their own stock market. That's not exactly fair. Okay, let's talk about the next thing, the second thing, which is talking about colonized places. So what do we hear from them? They say it's good for foreign colonies. Why? Because they say the EU wants natural resources, and because and they say that it's going to be bad on us, because the EU only wants natural resources, there's going to be no diversification. That's just not true, because there's, as Armin says, billions of people in there. That's why China has an interest at all in kind of partnering with them and investing in their infrastructure, because they want to access all these different consumers. This is a pretty big consumer power when you have billions of people. But apart from that, when we tell you it's even if they're doing some minimal good by the investment that they're doing, we don't think that it's worth 233 times the good of whatever they're doing, because that's how much they're taking out of the colonies. So it's not worth it on that basis. And finally, fine, even if it is totally worth it for economic reasons, whatever, we don't think that it's worth giving up your autonomy, control of your people, your long-term policy, and just ignoring years of colonialism and saying, you know what, it's okay that it came out of coercion. It's okay that we took over and completely oppressed you. We're fine with it. We don't think that we can just justify something because it came out of colonialism, but that was in the past. We can ignore it. That's not how we have to treat when something so principled as this. Okay, what else did they tell you? They said finally we want inter-African trade. That's what we prefer. Here's why inter-African trade cannot happen right now. Because there's lots of much to sell. Furthermore, there's small and local fractured markets, so they minimize efficiency and they maximize their cost. The opposite of the economy of scale. Apart from that, there's poor infrastructure for trade, there's corrupt customs officials, there's protected tariffs, and there's other trade barriers that exist currently. Those are all the reasons they can't trade right now. But if we take a hold for get rid of all these restrictions and Africa and other places can start building up their economies, then they can fix the infrastructure and all these other barriers. So if they really want African trade, we do it better because their side physically cannot have it. Our side gives you the chance of getting it in the future. Okay, what did we tell you? We told you how we're getting our talking. We told you about the practical benefits, and really they just kind of ignored this one. They just said, oh no, there's other good restrictions that come out of it. They didn't address all the parts of not controlling your monetary policy and how that affects you, of not being able to control what you're spending your budget on, of not being able to give out government contracts. So the example was in Ivory Coast right now. They wanted to build a bridge into a financial district. But France said, no, because we're going to make you charge a ton of money, and it couldn't be easily done. Because of that, they're actually hurting their economy and all sorts of other people. Okay. Africa and other colonized nations gave up their lives, gave up their future for Europe. We think Europe should do something in return. Let them free. We are done. We are proud.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't have a pretty introduction. I'm going straight into my themes because I have so many assertions to deal with right away. 1. The principle stands. 2. How does it affect foreign colonies? And 3. How does it affect the EU? So let's go to the principle stance. Look right away on the principle that they provide. Here they say that we think that principally regardless of the outcome, that we have an obligation to implement these free trade deals. We think that under their own logic, you have to look at the outcome. Why is that? Because they said that the colonies, foreign colonies, they have to benefit from this kind of policies because of the atrocities that happened in the past. So from their logic, they have to defend the outcome from that. They even talked about reparations as well, where you actually get an outcome out of it, where you can get some kind of practical benefit. They made that link themselves. They have to prevent the practical outcome. But we also say, even if you do have if you can justify just by principle, we care about way more how it affects real people, how it affects the former colonies and the EU as a whole. We think that's what we have to weigh in this debate. What was our principle stance? We told you that the EU has obligations to its own citizens, right? We think that this is something we have to weigh in this debate. Well, let me give you a further piece of analysis, right? We think that just the mere fact that it's all the EU states is inherently unfair to all of the EU states that didn't take part in colonizing Africa, that didn't take part in that. We think it's inherently unfair that they have to pay for something that other agents did. We think that that is something we have to recognize that is inherently unfair. Thirdly, within this one, they didn't actually respond to what in foreign aid isn't enough. What's inherently that we have a justification for free trade deals and not foreign aid instead. They have to defend this as the only mean. Second theme, the foreign colonies, right? Here they told us right away that they're going to increase the leverage over the own economy within these kind of foreign colonies, right? I have a few responses. Firstly, this is not inherent to trade deals, right? We think that what they're talking about, these mutual corporations that they have, we think that removing them would also just make them more independent, right? We think that free trade deals in and of themselves don't give them more leverage over the economy. They can do that without trade deals. We think that secondly then, the whole point they made about, well now we'll have tariffs, right? So we can protect the own economy of the former colony, right? So we're not going to destroy the economy, right? I have a few responses to this. The premise of this argument is also that the countries want to benefit from actually having this sort of mechanism in place. What happens then when they want to benefit is that they look towards the companies that can help them profit off the most of that. That is foreign companies, because of different reasons. Firstly, they have the know-how in most cases within different industries, and secondly, because they have the political and monetary capital to actually make a difference, it means that the foreign colonies are actually going to ask for the foreign companies to come into the country. We think this is inherently bad because it outcompetes the domestic industry and the domestic products, right? We think this is less likely to happen on our side, right? I mean, they're more likely to incentivize to invest in their own industry, right? We think that's bad. But I think that furthermore, we think that just this mere thing, that they're going to with terrorists, meaning that they're going to exploit this relationship because they don't have to pay anything in return. It means that they're only going to trade mostly with the EU from now on. Why is this inherently bad and inherent to their model, right? We think it has 4 reasons. Firstly, we think it's bad because once you have this kind of dependency on the EU, this kind of deal is probably going to cease to exist at some point when the EU states feel like they don't have a moral obligation 100 years from now, right? We think that at that point, when you're dependent upon the EU state and having that kind of deal, it's going to destroy your economy because you no longer have this sort of deal. Secondly, they have to learn to act with actual real economy in the world. That is that you'll have to have tariffs between different countries, and you cannot just have this beautiful agreement in every sort of way, right? It means that in order to actually have agreements with other countries where they can benefit of those industries, such as natural resources, which the EU isn't rich in, they need to actually focus on other types of industries. They can't do that if they simply have this kind of luxury deal with the EU. But thirdly, right, we think that when they focus on the West, right, we think that hurts the other industries that also could benefit the countries. We think that this buys into a point about natural resources, right? When they're going to depend a lot about that, on that, and they're going to export that to other countries, right? We think this is bad in the end because this is a barrier to actually overcoming the industrial barrier that most Western nations have overcome and investing in research instead of investing in natural resources. Fourth reason, no thank you. We think this is crucial to recognize that then you decrease the cooperation regionally. This is the point we made, right? We think the regional partnerships has 4 different benefits as a new outline to you that they really respond to. With the same standards, how we avoid exploitation, commodities, and food surplus, and integration between nations. They've yet to deal with this. Their only response was how patents are going to help regional cooperation. So that's really patents aren't going to help regional cooperation in any way. They're just going to help if you write into their analysis with actually just patenting a product within a state. So no, that doesn't really help. Here they make the point that about foreign policy. Here we think that the foreign policy that we talked about, we think we're just going to create more dependency on the colonial state. We're going to reinforce the colonialism, essentially because now you're going to be dependent on this luxury deal, right? We think this reinforces the narrative that you're going to need the former post-colonial state to actually come help you because you cannot take care of your own economy. This embraces the narrative. Before we move on, yes?
Okay, so can't these countries then say, fine, EU companies work here, we are going to put heavy regulation, tariffs, and taxes on you? They can't do that now because they don't own the resources currently. They're owned by those companies that you say are so benevolent.
Wait, the companies that are going in your model, they're still going to take the natural resources and then they're going to export them outside. I mean, give you the analysis, right? Essentially, they have the interest to go and actually get foreign companies into their countries, right? So let's go on back to the EU, right? Last point. Here we talked about how we increase immigration. Why does that with EU problem? They said they accepted this principally. Fine, they debated practically as well. But then they said the conditions are going to increase in the developing world and former colonies, so that they don't want to go to the EU. I'm sorry guys, so in the real world, you aren't suddenly just going to have the new EU in Africa, right? We think that they're going to take a slow change, and the immediate perspective of actually being able to go to EU is greater, right? But then we say the point about then we make the point about the EU and how companies have been going to profit off of that, right? We see that the EU is harmed a lot, essentially because now you decrease the standards and you decrease the ability to compete with anyone. But they kind of even with the trade deal isn't even both ways, right? But furthermore, when the trade deal isn't both ways, we also can disguise into the narrative that the EU project is failing. We have to take this at all grounds. We take this at the EU level, we take this at the national level, and essentially we look and analyze how it affects badly the former colonies. Thank you.
It was a strategic mistake that they based their case on a principle which we proved is not mutually exclusive to their motion, because we told you could still have the same principle with reparation damages and foreign aid. Insofar, what we literally only have left is whose side is better to the economy. That is exclusively what we must focus the debate upon today. The second strategic mistake was this idea of not addressing my entire point of immigration. I proved to you why this is crucial, because you're going to see a huge influx of immigrants who are literally so desperate they just see this vision of the EU, they flock to here, and how the EU is ultimately going to break up as a result of this, because we have seen this surge of anti-immigrant sentiment. Literally all of their benefits cannot stand, insofar we will not have an EU that can provide the lack of these restrictions to this side of the house. Since they did not respond to that, we are fundamentally taking today's debate, because we cannot have an EU without such thing. Okay, two big themes of today. First of all, let's talk a little bit about diversifying the economy, something we continue to fail to do. We told you that the EU only wants specific things, just as companies. Essentially, you used to have the Rome Treaty, as I proved to you, where you had the motion in which they told you, but what that only left you was no benefit for all the post-colonial states, such as Congo, because these people could only introduce raw materials. What then happened due to this access to the EU market is that they're now locked in a situation where 80% of the entire production is these sort of companies that create huge dependency on the fluctuating market. But in the end, we decided to repeal this sort of thing because it eventually did not benefit. Insofar they did not prove a benefit, how it will not benefit in the future, we take them on the diversifying of the economy. Why is that? Because the inherent problem of today. Here we talked to you a lot about the example of biofuels. Biofuels, we said that the EU has a huge amount. The companies in these countries are going to want to cater to the EU because without the tariffs, they're going to be able to earn a lot more than, providing food to the population. Why is that really important? Because essentially what we're going to see, if we're going to have biofuels being sent to the EU, but not being able to have the population afford this sort of food. That is absolutely crucial in today's debate. Because companies are going to benefit, people cannot afford this sort of food. That is why we must have these sort of restrictions to make sure that there's always an inherent incentive for these countries to make sure that populations are good. Let's get into the second thing of today's debate, which is the entire idea of monetary policy. What did they try to tell you? Guys, let's just give a lot of this money to corrupt governments all down the bench because these people know what to do. That is totally absurd. We think that the reason why we still have a somewhat stable economy is because these people have an ability to directly link the currency to the franc, meaning you will not have a completely financial breakdown. We think the exact, when they use Zimbabwe as an example, they kind of realize this, but they decided to completely go back on that example because Zimbabwe literally lifted restrictions, resulting in the financial crackdown which they said. Insofar they agree that Zimbabwe was a failed idea, then they must also concede to the idea that it is good to have France ensuring a sort of stable economy, because this makes sure that investors from all other countries can trust the economy to not just fail, meaning you're going to have more foreign aid, as I told you, coming into this kind of country. So that's something just talk about the entire principal idea of these countries are going to be so much worse off because they can only buy French products. Why is that specifically good after today's debate? Why is that restriction so important? Because essentially what we tell you is that France provides this sort of 10 million people to them. And France also has an inherent interest in these economies doing well when they can only buy French products. That means implementing things such as, democracy, that is things that's going to make the economy grow better. Why is that? Because they cannot buy the cheaper Chinese things. Why is that specifically important in today's debate? Because China is never going to feel responsibility for these colonial states. China is never going to vote in favor of them in the UN. Therefore, it is important that we have these sort of restrictions so we can have this sort of big one that continues to help us in the sense, because these economies are simply not ready to uplift all these restrictions. These economies are not ready to go ahead and simply, get all this money. They will not know what to do with it. It might sound imperialistic, but if you're simply debating on the chance of damaging the economy, then you cannot stand for it. We win today's debate because they didn't address immigration, they didn't address how the entire EU is going to break up. We win because they didn't fully address the diversification of the economy, how these people are only going to cater to the EU without their population. And we win because it's actually really good to have someone to watch out for our economy. Thank you.
paternalism and Orientalism in that case than there was in the Nicolas Sarkozy quote. I never really thought I was going to use that when I came out here, but I guess it was what we have to do. Team Denmark today had a severe lack of engagement in this round. They chose to take one part of our model, misconstrue it, and then base their entire case on the idea that like free trade on an economic level might be bad in some cases. So even if they're absolutely right about all of this, the reason that they need to address the principle is that autonomy and sovereignty are principles in and of themselves. They're not dependent on whether or not like some other country can take better care of you. I think people want the right to self-assert because they want the right to self-assert because they want control over their own destiny. They have not had that. Team Canada wants to give it. It's also worth noting that when this is a debate about all restrictions on former colonies, they have to talk about all of those restrictions. They could have said something about all of the other restrictions that we pointed out, but the very fact that they chose not even to engage with it is a strategic flaw on their side. Otherwise, they have to explain why they don't have to talk about it. Okay. On this idea of the principle, and then to the benefits. On this idea of the principle, they say, look, EU citizens matter more because the EU is accountable to them, so they have to help them. And they're like, look, subsidies are really good because we can make things preferential for our economy. And then they just kind of left it there, right? And the rebuild was basically rehashing the same analysis because I think they realized that you can't just say that because your people are really important to you, you get to forget about all the bad things you've done to all the people across the collective history. So I'm not really wondering why they can just kind of dismiss all of the damage, right? And then they say, okay, well, the EU is actually helping them, but I'm going to deal with that in a second. Also, they say, look, all EU states, and this was like a little thing where I thought was funny, like all EU states don't colonize, so why are we talking about all EU states? Like, we're talking about all EU states that had former colonies. Obviously, they can have colonies, you can't remove restrictions from your former colonies. Autonomy matters as a principle. Asking the EU to defend the economic interests of their former colonies is like asking the wolf to guard the hen. We think that's ridiculous. Now to this idea of outcome. They say, look, free trade is really bad. And we're like, since when was it free trade, right? We can put all kinds of regulations and controls and tariffs on them to prevent the inundation of all these colonial markets with these EU companies, to make it so that even if these EU companies go there, that they have control over how they operate, over where that money is being invested. We don't see why that's mutually exclusive to our side. But furthermore, Adithya told you why you'll actually get better deals on our side of the house, when there isn't this inherent predatory nature to that relationship, when there isn't an inherent mistrust that comes from the fact that restrictions are still placed on them, right? Then they say, oh look, like these businesses suck in the colonies, so we have to like give them EU businesses, right? Which is really kind of ridiculous. Because if you think about it, they can't just assert that these businesses won't be able to work for themselves when they've never been independent enough to even try before. I think they have to acknowledge that there are millions of very smart people in all of these colonies who know how to run their own affairs but have been denied the opportunity. And they say, well, like, okay, EU markets will have control because the EU has a lot of money, so they'll only export there. And I think we've told you down the bench that that's not really true, right? There are a lot of people in all these economies. The China example was to show that other developing nations are realizing the potential of these markets and are investing there on much more fair terms. We don't see why that's going to not happen on our side. We think that's going to happen a lot more. But even if EU companies are used, right, we still say that you can regulate them in the status quo, and we think that once these economies start to develop, of course they'll be able to export to each other easier. Then they have this thing that was like, okay, so the EU will opt out of the EU, right, because they're going to be afraid of immigrants, right? Okay, just because they opt out of the EU does not mean their countries like change, right? They're still subject to our model whether or not they're part of the EU or not. This wasn't an EU policy, this was a policy from those countries. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have to take from this debate is that Team Denmark didn't engage with it in its full breadth. They completely let go of the principle, and their state paternalism and Orientalism are the exact things that colonialism has done wrong and that we want to avenge today. Thank you very much.